Este es un panel organizado por la Asociación Latinoamericana de Investigadores de la Comunicación, ALAIC, para el Congreso de IAMCR 2022, que se desarrolla en Beijing y en cualquier lugar del mundo a donde nos encontremos. Nuestra propuesta para este panel se titula Descolonizar y sumar, comunicación, diálogos y cooperación de investigadores y asociaciones. Este panel que proponemos desde ALAIC busca dar continuidad a nuestra participación a lo largo de anteriores ediciones del Congreso de IAMCR, promoviendo la construcción de un diálogo entre diferentes personas de diferentes latitudes del planeta y enmarcando esta discusión en una perspectiva decolonial de la comunicación. Un debate que coordinamos yo, Daniela Monge, y el vicepresidente de ALAIC, Fernando Oliveira Paulino. Esperamos, a partir de este diálogo, sistematizar propuestas y acciones que puedan intensificar la cooperación entre investigaciones y asociaciones a partir de prácticas relacionadas con el reconocimiento de las diferencias y las similitudes.
Este panel cuenta con la participación de expertos y expertas internacionales, y para ello invitamos gente que de alguna manera estudia, investiga situaciones y cuestiones relacionadas a comunicación, decolonialidad, flujo informativo y comunicacional. Es un honor a nuestra Asociación Latinoamericana de Investigadores de la Comunicación contar en este panel con Deqiang Ji, nuestro querido profesor desde la Universidad de la Communication University of China, y que es allá el vicedecano del Instituto por la Comunicación con un Futuro Compartido. Tenemos igualmente Viola Milton desde la Universidad de Sudáfrica, donde trabaja el Departamento de Ciencias de la Comunicación y es editora del Communication South Africa Journal for Communication Theory and Research. Igualmente tenemos acá nuestro querido presidente de la Asociación Latinoamericana de Investigadores de la Comunicación, Gabriel Kaplún, que es profesor en la Universidad de la República en Uruguay. La vicepresidenta de la IAMCR, Andrea Medrado, que es incluso profesora de la Universidad Federal Fluminense en Río de Janeiro, Brasil. Y tenemos Beate Josephi, que es asociada honorária do Departamento de Medios e Communications de la Universidad de Sydney y fue integrante del board, del executive board, del directivo de la asociación de la IAMCR y integrante del Consejo Internacional. Cada uno de ustedes tendrá 10 minutos para hacer la presentación y después de las presentaciones que empezarán con Deqiang, tenemos un tiempo para comentarios y preguntas. Por favor, Deqiang, Xixi, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I think I would like to share some my PowerPoint. Could you please allow me to share my PowerPoint? I think now I can't.
Gabo, ¿podrías permitir que comparta la presentación, por favor?
Okay, now I can. Thank you so much. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this wonderful session organized by ALAIC. And I'm from Communication University of China. I'm so glad to see so many old friends virtually here today. Okay, so I'm going to take the 10 minutes to share some of my current reflections over the history of communication studies in China, especially in the Chinese mainland in the past 4 decades. and try to resonate with today's session's theme, decolonization. Even China was not a fully colonized country in the 20th century or even earlier, but we still have to struggle with this kind of intellectual endeavor to figure out what is the academic subjectivity in the global communication research academia. So I named my presentation Indigenization and Decolonization, Reflections on the 40 years history of communication studies in China. Actually, this year is very critical, very important for the communication studies, especially in the Chinese mainland, because in 1982, actually the year we are being considered as the year of departure for the communication studies in the Chinese mainland, because a very important visit, academic visit by Wilbur Schramm from the United States. Even today, most of the Chinese scholars believe that the year of 1982 should be the year we think about the beginning of the communication studies in China after the Cultural Revolution. So even there's some debate, and some people debate that maybe we can take the history earlier than 1982, because there's some other so-called Western scholars visiting China as well, including the Dallas Smythe from Canada in 1970s, who also laid a very strong foundation for academic cooperation between China and Western scholars. But I think for most of the scholars here in China, we have to admit that the people believe that 1982 is the year when we start the change of journalism and communication studies after the Cultural Revolution. So so I have to share with you this very interesting picture took by someone in 1982. Is the year I was born. I have to. So this is the national symposium, the first national symposium of communication studies, organized by the Institute of Journalism Studies in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So the first one, actually, after the Cultural Revolution. Actually, and also this symposium was organized after the visit by Wilbur Schramm. It's kind of following event after Wilbur Schramm's visit to introduce what is mass communication theory from the United States. So so this year, people are working together right now to celebrate this 40 years of national gathering, the first national gathering of scholars from all around China, especially from the Chinese mainland, to think about what is the position of communication studies of China in the new world picture. So I think we are still in this kind of intellectual history. Okay, and also I have to highlight, actually, this is not only the scholars from the Chinese mainland, but also related to the scholars from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, the other overseas Chinese scholars. Wilbur Schramm's visit was accompanied by one of his students who is working in the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So actually, this history was interconnected between the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and many overseas Chinese scholars. So this is a kind of milestone year for us, for our reflections about the intellectual history of communication studies in the Chinese mainland. So after his visit, what happened, especially in 1980s, 1990s? I think we have to pay attention to some important, because the time limit, I didn't include many details, just summarize some key point I want to make regarding the so-called institutionalization of communication studies in China. It's not only the beginning, but institutionalized, especially into the so-called higher educational system. So I summarize three key points. The first one is the hybridization of a mediated Western paradigm and the indigenous pursuit of both paradigmatic shift and academic subjectivity in a globalizing context. I'm sorry, there's a typo here. So I mean, the hybridization means the Chinese scholars in the 1980s really want to have a different kind of position in rebuilding Chinese social sciences. Because at that time, there's no communication studies or mass communication theory, just the so-called party journalism theories. So they really want to have something new, especially after the Cultural Revolution. So at that time, Wilbur Schramm and the theory that he brought to the Chinese mainland provide a solution. So I call it a mediated Western paradigm, which means it's not a totally Western theory imported into the Chinese mainland, but it's mediated, it's selected by some Chinese scholars to to have our theoretical resources to build a new vocabulary of how to do research about mass media, about journalism, about the press. So there's a very strong indigenous pursuit of having a paradigmatic shift from the traditional political theory to kind of scientific theory. So in this case, the Wilbur Schramm's with it provide option. So this is kind of articulation what happened in 1980s. And also I have to mention that there's very strong a drive of the new state market society framework under the policy, the so-called policy of opening up and reform. So communication studies emerged and they have to respond to, for example, how to respond to the new relationship between the state, market, and society. And within this framework, the media was relocated. So previously, the media served the political purposes, but after the reform and opening up policy, announced there's an emerging media market. So the media theory or the communication theory should respond to this kind of marketization process. So this is how communication studies, developed in the 1980s to respond to some new kind of developmental oriented, communication issues and policy issues. And finally, we can see even until today, we can see in the Chinese universities or the research institutions, we have a parallel structure under the so-called journalism and communication and media studies. We have the parallel structure. One logic is the Marxist journalism, which has very strong kind of deeply rooted into the Marxist political theory and its influence in the journalism studies. And the second is the kind of what I call it recontextualized or articulated Western journalism and communication studies in the Chinese universities. So we saw both logics, existing together. So I consider this is at least the three component of the institutionalization of communication studies in the Chinese mainland. But regarding to the topic of today's session, so I would like to share with you two dimensions of the so-called indigenization and decolonization. So what is the indigenization process in a historical context regarding the Chinese communication scholars' pursuit of academic subjectivity? I think there are many different interpretations. I didn't provide all the citations here, just to summarize what I observed as a communication scholar in China. The first one is Westernization, as I mentioned before. It's not only a one-dimensional kind of importation from a Western country to a Eastern country or to China. It's a process of articulation. So Westernization in China is a solution for some kind of indigenous pursuit of a paradigmatic shift from political theory to scientific theory. So there's a very strong need or demand for a new theoretical framework to understand the relations between state, market, society, and the role of the media. So in the 1980s, so against the background of the reform opening up policy, this is kind of dialectical process we have to pay attention to. And the second is one central mechanism for the entire media system, changing is the marketization process since 1980s until today. So marketization-driven, industrialization process really create a strong need for theoretical innovation. So there are some new communication theories, either borrowed from some Western countries or created empirically from the domestic context, emerged, including, for example, media economics or media management. So even today, there are some scholars who are working on this kind of topic, which also enrich the diversity of communication scholarship in the Chinese mainland. And finally, is the cultural self-determination, mindset. China has never stopped its long-standing civilization for thousands of years. It's not only in modernization process, but also how to revitalize its cultural centralism, in building its kind of intellectual history. It's very important for different generations of communication scholars in China, even including the generation like me and even the younger generations. They still hold a very strong kind of cultural self-determination mindset in creating some kind of indigenous theory to interpret what happened here in China and also to build a dialogue with the global academic sphere. So I think those are the three key dimensions to understand the indigenization process of communication studies, especially in the Chinese mainland. And and regarding the decolonization, as I said before, China was never fully colonized by the foreign country, but we call ourselves a semi-colonized society in 19th century and 20th century. So, so we share some kind of collective memory with other colonies in the world, but we have something different. So that's why I think we have to think decolonization in our intellectual history as in relation to the indigenization process. So it's not only decolonization or against the decolonization or against the colonization. It's decolonization and indigenization. They are working together or mutually enhanced to build a kind of China's version of communication studies, even which is not totally a Chinese version of communication theory. And following, for example, Professor Zhao Yuezhi's claim, this is something similar with other non-Western countries to transcend a Euro-American bias of the field. It's very critical for long run, for long history. But my point is we have to transcend this kind of bias from within. After 4 decades of opening up and joining the globalization process, China was really, most of Chinese communication scholars, they learn a lot, or even they articulate a lot the theories or inspirations from the so-called Western world, which is not a totally Western theory, but is already domesticated. But in order to build a new kind of paradigm, in order to try to overcome this colonized mindset in our theoretical building, we have to deal with this kind of decolonization from within, instead of only building a dichotomy between us and the Western world or China or the outside world. This is not working. So I think for sustainable theoretical innovation, we have to build a kind of transcending mindset from within, instead of keep reflecting what we have in our mind to think about the communication or media issues that happen here in China or in the global sphere. And taking inspirations from other non-Western traditions, which is always the source of inspiration, the source of theoretical innovation for the communication scholars here in the Chinese mainland. And finally, I think the country as big as China should also be considered as a place which have a lot of different indigenous communication practices or experiences. I think we are still in shortage of this kind of theorization, not instead from already existing theories, but from the very dynamic and rich communication practices here in this country. So I think we have to pay attention to this kind of indigenous experiences, like the media practices or the social media or the internet development, and try to theorize or conceptualize what happened here in academic vocabulary, and try to generalize those vocabularies or concepts for an international academic dialogue, and also avoiding deteriorized notions. I mean, there's a lot of so-called universal notions, but it's not very related to different territories in the world. I think there are a lot of things we can keep in mind, especially as a typical Chinese communication scholar, especially in the Chinese mainland, to think about what is the academic subjectivity in this new kind of globalizing context, and try to contribute instead of only building different dichotomies between us and others. So I hope that helps for you to understand or to get to know what happened here in the Chinese mainland and how we try to reflect our own intellectual history and to contribute more to the global understanding of the diversity of the communication scholarship. All right, that's my presentation. Thank you so much for the invitation again.
Many thanks, colleagues. I'm assuming it is my turn now. Also for the opportunity to be here today and to present from South Africa some opinions and perspectives on the topic at hand. I was part of a discussion a couple of weeks ago that had to do with instabilities and crises and what the place of communication might be in a context where we are consistently and constantly being confronted with one crisis after the other. And I thought that some of the ideas that I shared there would be very relevant for us today also. So I've structured what I want to say today around 6 key points. The first of these being that the past is in the future in as much as the future is in the past. So in South Africa, and I would suppose in other post-colonial states also, we used to say in the immediate aftermath of apartheid, never again would this happen. Never again would we allow our media to be censored. Never again would we allow our police to take matters into their own hands. Never again would we allow a non-democratic infringement upon the rights of people. But now, almost 2 decades after apartheid, I think we've come to realize that never again is an empty mantra, because the past has a habit of repeating itself. For example, in the early 2000s, I wrote about the representation of Africa in HIV/AIDS discourses globally and the practical implications thereof for the lived experiences and realities of people in Africa. And I had very little good to say about that. In the late '00s, I wrote about the representations of Africans in the Ebola debates and the practical implications thereof for the lived realities and experiences of Africans. And I had very little good to say about that. Then in the 2020s, which is starting from 2020, a lot of research came out about the representation of different vulnerable communities with regards to COVID and the practical implications thereof for the lived realities of these marginalized and vulnerable groups, and very little good could be said thereof. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, a new disease reared its head, monkeypox discourses. And again, we started to read about the ways in which vulnerable communities, LGBTQIA+, Black people, people from African descent, how they were characterized within these debates, and nothing good could be said thereof. So clearly, never again is an empty mantra. This morning, I read The Guardian, and there some Home Affairs workers had written about the current direction that the UK is taking in terms of migrants, where they are actually moving forward with moving migrants that arrive there on the boats from the UK to Rwanda. And what they had to say was, and I will just very quickly directly quote from them. They say, if the racial priorities in our work weren't clear enough from the Windrush scandal, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has rammed the point home. They say, of course, innocent people bombed out of their homes must be offered help and a place to rebuild their lives if they choose to. Yet, they say, this is hardly the only war going on. The difference in response when there are white faces involved couldn't be more stark. Whole new visa routes were created with vastly more generous conditions, such as not being banned from working or accessing vital public funds. Ukraine, they say, like COVID, has shown some glimpses of how the UK government can rouse itself to care for people and support lives, but only sometimes. They then ask, why is this kind of response never happened for the people in the desperate situations in Yemen, Ethiopia, Sudan, Palestine, Afghanistan, let alone the climate crisis? Globally, we are seeing escalating protests around continued inequalities and also an ironic return to policing that seeks to silence dissent. So before decolonization, within the post-colonial debates, we talk about giving voice, right? Decolonization says, let's not give voice, let's pass the mic. dissent laws in countries globally are now saying, let's stifle voice. Let's stop people in their tracks before they even come forward. So in the face of continued pro-democracy struggles, one should ask, what then have our research within a communication environment contributed to fundamentally altering and changing the lives and the lived realities for the people in whose interests we are doing the work that we do? What difference did our research make? Why is it that 5 years after the Fees Must Fall protests here in South Africa and globally, and decades after the end of formal colonization, is it still the case that the values and knowledge systems of the Euro-American world is not only known to us, but continue to be proselytized as the norm for human and societal conduct to the extent of defining and even defying others? Why does it remain the case that non-conformity to those norms continue to at times result in blatant aggression against weaker non-Western states? So the question that I would like to address today is, if there is no such thing as never again, then what do we as communication scholars in conversation with each other, what is it that we need to do to adapt to a context of continued crises? And the first thing that I would like to suggest, in line with decolonial approaches, is that we need to embrace a convivial epistemological approach. What does that mean? It means that we need to recognize and make provision for the reality of being incomplete. African scholar Francis Nyamjo says that incompleteness is the normal order of things, and that conviviality invites us to celebrate and preserve incompleteness, and to then mitigate delusions of grandeur that come with ambitions and claims of completeness. So conviviality then encourages us to not only recognize our own incompleteness, it also challenges us to be open-minded and open-ended in our claims and our articulations of identities, of being and of belonging. It encourages us, and this is where the theme of this conference also shines through, it encourages us to reach out, to encounter and to explore ways of enhancing or complementing ourselves with the added possibilities of potency brought our way by the incompleteness of others also. This then asks us to engage in decolonial listening, which is the third point that I want to bring to the table today. Arundhati Roy pointed out years ago that there really is no such thing as the voiceless. They are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. So I would argue today that within the communication studies community, there's a need for us to move away from only giving voice to also decolonial listening. This then is a way to perceive and attend to the alternative voices silenced by the modernity project, some of which Deqiang had pointed out in his talk also. This, amongst other things, requires an acute awareness of history, of heritage, and of legacies, both in society and in the academy. So we need radical approaches to research, to pedagogy, to intellectualism, which then would entail the art of listening that is combined with the practice of theorizing in the service of expanding who belongs to this public and to this community that we are trying to reach. What this then means is that as communication scholars, our work should ideally echo with the voices of the deliberately silenced and those purposefully unheard by the disciplinary center. This, in my view, will constitute an act of decolonial listening, which brings me to my fifth point, which is that if we are to engage in such an act of decolonial listening, we need to move away from a prestige economy in favor of a relevance economy. African scholar Colin Chauncey talks about the need for us to move towards a relevance economy. In other words, he argues that the work that we do the discourses that we engage in, and the curriculums that we develop need to take cognizance of and need to focus its attention on problems that are more public and pressing in terms of their relevance to address important social issues, whatever these may be and wherever these may be. This then connects to our pedagogical inclinations, right? So the decolonial turn asks what needs to change in order for universities in Africa, and I would assume in other global south spaces also, to become African universities rather than universities in Africa. What research methodologies and knowledge about our particular context, about our fields of study, about the global context is needed for us to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery? Like cultural studies that precedes its popularity in, for example, media studies, it assumes an emancipatory and activist stance in that it encourages the emergence of another thinking, another knowledge, and another worldview. Yeah, again, I would like to reference the work of Mullen, who notes that it is important for us to not only talk about pedagogy outside of the classroom, but to think through pedagogy within the classroom so that we do not become complacent in repeating the same issues that we critique outside of the classroom space. So in terms of pedagogy, we need to ask ourselves, is decolonizing the academy a teleological process? What is the end point? What does the D in decolonization mean? Does it mean out? And what is it that we are getting out? And what is it that we are keeping? If decolonization implies a twin process of provincializing Western knowledge's universal pretensions, as well as developing relevant local knowledge, then we need to ask how this can be borne out in, for example, communication studies, and how communication and media are driven by global logics. What then are the implications thereof for decolonizing the communication space, such as the journalism that our contexts engage in, as well as the teaching of journalism in our classrooms? For us to contemplate what a radical educational agenda would be, we need to figure out what we intuitively know and understand and how to translate that to the classroom. And this brings me to my last point here. And for that, we need what Giraud has called civic courage. So then, he argues that the time has come for intellectuals to distinguish caution from cowardice and to recognize that ever fashionable display of rhetorical cleverness as a form of disguised decadence. Civic courage, he says, is needed to imagine a more dignified, equitable, and just world. In this sense, then, my colleague Winston Mano and myself have developed what we call the theory of Afroecology, or rather Afroecology as a heuristic tool to approach communication studies. And for us, this would then entail the following, right? So we call it Afroecology because it's about centering Africa within the African context. But it also has broader implications for the global South, we would argue, because it is in the first place cognizant of the socio-political dynamics of global South cultures, while its philosophical undercurrent is defined by the needs and ideals within these contexts. It thus promotes self-understanding in global South context through, and these are my final few points, producing epistemologies of knowledge based on global South lived experiences and exploring their global implications. It is about critical self-interrogations of the views, concept, and contours of the decolonization projects. Deqiang also referred to that a little bit in his talk. It is about accumulation of global South-inspired scientific knowledge that has the potential to transform and even improve the lives of especially marginalized people, as it emphasizes a normative framework that defines the media's role or the communications role primarily in relation to the citizenry rather than the state. It acknowledges the relevance of the global North even as it assumes a more collective dimension in intervening in evolving policy challenges in global South contexts. Finally, it establishes a critical mass of scholars, which is what I think this conference is trying to do today, a critical mass of scholars and non-scholars working together strategically towards achieving the valorization of marginalized humanity, and then the creative diversity of being other in this world. Therefore, I would like to end by saying that what is needed within an anthropological sense is for us to reflect a construction of social reality within the socio-political context of the global South. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you, Viola, for your presentation. Viola es profesora de la Universidad de Sudáfrica y a continuación, tras esta presentación de Viola y la presentación anterior de Deqiang, tendremos la ocasión de escucharle a nuestro presidente de ALAIC, Gabriel Kaplún, por favor.
Bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes o buenas noches para todos los que estamos aquí. Es una alegría poder encontrarnos desde tantas partes. Para ALAIC es especialmente grato, porque venimos desde hace ya un tiempo intentando estos diálogos con otras partes del mundo, sabiendo, intuyendo que hay mucho en común y que hay muchas diferencias, pero que esas diferencias pueden enriquecer nuestro diálogo. Como Daniela no pudo hacerlo bien, me gustaría reiterar un poco la agenda de esta conversación para los que nos van a escuchar después, agenda que ya está en curso, porque quienes me precedieron ya la fueron cubriendo. Decíamos en la convocatoria, y decía Daniela, que buscamos identificar agendas y problemas específicos en el marco de una geopolítica del conocimiento que construye y refuerza diferentes modos de subalternidad y periferia. Estas acciones, decíamos, están vinculadas a los lenguajes, los saberes legitimados, los sistemas de evaluación y medición que definen modos de circulación del conocimiento. Queremos por eso indagar, conocer y hacer lugar a las formas epistémicas, metodológicas, participativas y pedagógicas que se tejen a partir del sur global. Esta es nuestra agenda de conversación y el término decolonización la precede. Estos diálogos buscando decolonizar y sumar. Entonces, yo quisiera plantear sobre esta base tres puntos, tres asuntos, con una cuestión previa. ¿Qué entendemos por decolonizar? ¿Qué quiere decir este término que parece que se ha puesto de moda en el mundo académico del sur y en el mundo en general? Y yo partiría allí de primero definir qué es lo colonial. Lo colonial, tal como lo estamos entendiendo en América Latina, no se refiere solamente a un momento histórico, al momento de la colonización. Lo colonial está presente hoy. Está presente hoy no solo porque quedan las huellas de aquel momento colonizador, sino porque hay algo que lo colonial ejerce que se sigue ejerciendo hoy. Lo colonial básicamente quiere decir lo siguiente, para decirlo de un modo sencillo, o así lo estamos entendiendo. Quiere decir que lo diferente es menos. Que si tú eres diferente en el sexo, en el color de tu piel, en el lugar donde vives, en la clase social a la que perteneces, en la manera en que produces y haces circular tus saberes, si eres diferente, eres menos. Porque alguien define que hay un parámetro al que hay que ajustarse y quienes están fuera de ese parámetro valen menos. valen tanto menos incluso que pueden ser considerados no humanos. Me parece que ahí está la clave de lo colonial. Por eso que se ejerció durante un periodo de nuestras historias, periodos distintos para África que para América Latina o que para Asia o que para Australia, esos distintos momentos, a veces muy recientes, como en el caso de África, a veces más antiguos, como en el caso de nuestra América Latina, sigue funcionando hoy, no solo por las huellas, sino porque sigue habiendo esta actitud y esta manera de vivir colonizada. Entonces, a partir de esta definición, la decolonización es volver a poner en diálogo de iguales a quienes son diferentes. Esa es la idea central. Volver a considerar legítimos todos los géneros, todas las voces, todos los saberes. Entonces, quisiera plantear 3 puntos para nuestra agenda de conversación. El primero es decolonizar la comunicación. Yo creo que ahí el desafío actual es, por un lado, retomar nuestra vieja agenda de los años 80, aquella que planteó la Asamblea Mundial de UNESCO a partir del informe McBride. Aquel informe, que tuvo voces de todo el mundo, planteaba la necesidad de escuchar todas las voces. Su título ya era muy sugestivo: Un solo mundo, voces múltiples. Desde ese lugar se intentaron en todo el mundo esfuerzos que hoy podríamos mirar como decolonizadores, decoloniales. Ese esfuerzo podemos y debemos retomarlo hoy. Debemos seguir además las huellas que fue dejando con distintos nombres, con distintas expresiones. Por ejemplo, en América Latina, aquel informe que había tenido voces latinoamericanas muy potentes, pudo hacer poco en la realidad, porque encontró a nuestra América Latina en un momento de dictaduras, donde poco podía hacerse por democratizar la comunicación. Pero los años 2000 encontraron una América Latina con mucho impulso para retomar esa agenda democratizadora. Por eso, en nuestro continente hubo esfuerzos de nuevas regulaciones, nuevas leyes, nuevos impulsos desde los estados y desde la sociedad para democratizar la comunicación. Hoy estamos en un momento muy difícil, una ola neoconservadora, unas derechas renovadas han barrido en muchas partes con esos esfuerzos democratizadores. Pero además, estamos en un momento muy distinto de aquel origen, sobre todo porque el mundo digital nos presenta desafíos nuevos. ¿Qué significa la democratización hoy en este mundo digital? Ese es el desafío que tenemos que pensar, y yo lo sintetizaría en una frase. Así como el Foro Social Mundial hace ya unos cuantos años planteó que otro mundo es posible, podemos y debemos plantearnos que otra Internet es posible. Y pensar cómo puede ser esa Internet diferente, Internet que posibilita diálogos como no posibilitaban los medios tradicionales del siglo XX, medios muy unidireccionales, sobre la base del broadcasting, de la emisión de uno a muchos. Internet que sí posibilita los diálogos se ha vuelto a la vez, junto con esa potencialidad dialógica, un lugar de ruido, un lugar de manipulación, un lugar donde las grandes empresas son más dueñas aún del poder de la comunicación de lo que eran las tradicionales empresas de medios. Esa potencialidad hacia un lado o hacia el otro está presente, Y entonces nuestra agenda tiene que pensar hoy qué significa democratizar la comunicación y habilitar todas las voces en un diálogo que construye en nuevas condiciones. Creo que ahí tenemos una agenda en común. Pensar McBride hoy en un mundo digital. Pensar otra Internet como posibilidad y como algo que ya se está haciendo en muchas partes, a veces muy minoritario, muchas veces muy oculto, darle visibilidad a esos esfuerzos y buscar los modos de generalizarlos tiene que formar, creo yo, parte de nuestra agenda hoy. Y quienes estamos aquí tenemos cosas para aportar. Pero también esa agenda de otra comunicación tiene que reconocer formas de comunicación que están fuera de lo digital y fuera de lo mediático. En América Latina, por ejemplo, se han hecho esfuerzos muy interesantes para recuperar lo que fue y lo que sigue siendo la comunicación previa a aquel momento colonizador. Y me gusta mucho una expresión de indígenas colombianos que planteaban hace unos años que para ellos hay una comunicación propia y una comunicación apropiada. La comunicación propia es la comunicación que circula alrededor del fogón, donde la gente se reúne para conversar, alrededor de ese fuego que reúnen las noches para que se cuenten las historias, para que nos contemos cómo somos y cómo queremos vivir. Esa comunicación sigue importando y sigue valiendo. Y en este momento pospandémico lo necesitamos quizás mucho más que antes, porque es cierto que podemos encontrarnos aquí, alrededor de este fuego que Zoom nos permite, pero también es cierto que necesitamos el encuentro, el abrazo. Como dice mi coterráneo Mario Benedetti, en este tiempo de Internet y otras navegaciones, yo sigo prefiriendo el beso artesanal, que desde siempre comunica tanto. Entonces, esa comunicación otra también tenemos que reconocerla en este mundo digital. Ambas conviven y hacer de Internet, como dicen los indígenas colombianos, y hacer de la radio y la televisión, que siguen importando y vayas importan en nuestras sociedades, comunicación apropiada, de la que podamos apropiarnos, hacerla propia, y no solamente ajena. Junto con este esfuerzo de decolonizar la comunicación, quiero plantear otros dos que creo que van juntos y van muy articulados. Decolonizar la forma en que investigamos la comunicación, en que producimos saberes sobre la comunicación. Y esto tiene mucho que ver con la decolonización del mundo académico, que ha sido colonizado por un patrón, una forma de producir, una forma de evaluar, una forma de medir. Digo, por ejemplo, ¿qué saberes importan? ¿Solamente los saberes producidos en las universidades, en nuestro mundo académico? ¿Cómo ponemos en diálogo esos saberes con los producidos en otros espacios? Saberes muy potentes. Por ejemplo, esta idea de la comunicación propia o apropiada no nació en la academia. Nació de indígenas colombianos reunidos alrededor del fuego. ¿Cómo hacemos para no solo reconocer esos saberes, investigarlos desde la academia, que sí que tenemos que hacerlo, sino dialogar de igual a igual con ellos? Porque si solo los convertimos en un paper interesante, está bien, ayuda a nuestro diálogo académico, pero no siempre somos capaces de invitar y de acercarnos nosotros mismos a una conversación, a ese fogón, a ese fuego encendido por indígenas colombianos. Que seamos capaces de incorporar el cuerpo a la producción de saberes. La producción de saberes en nuestros mundos académicos parecen solo hechas para el texto y para el speech, para el hablar en una conferencia. Textos que muchas veces se evaporan rápidamente y que dejan poca huella, poca memoria. Seguramente en nuestros recorridos recordamos algunos momentos académicos muy potentes y casi siempre son esos momentos que parecen no académicos. Cuando alguien lloró, cuando alguien se emocionó y nos hizo llorar y emocionarnos. ¿Cuántas veces pasa eso en nuestro mundo académico? Pocas, seguramente. Eso nos dice justamente que es un mundo que se acartonó, que es muy duro, y nos pasa que al investigar la comunicación justamente nos perdemos el diálogo, nos perdemos el abrazo. Y ese mundo académico, y acá voy a mi tercer y último punto, porque quiero ser lo más breve posible, ese mundo académico, no solo el nuestro de la comunicación, sino el de todas las ciencias sociales, requiere hoy repensarse, y por suerte se están haciendo esfuerzos en todo el mundo, y creo que podemos entre nosotros construir una agenda de trabajo. Para decirlo también muy sintéticamente, ¿qué es lo que hoy se valora en ese mundo? Principalmente la productividad, la producción. Y la producción además quiere decir artículos en inglés, en revistas arbitradas de alto impacto. Cada uno de estos términos merece análisis y crítica. Artículos. ¿Por qué artículos? ¿Por qué no libros? Los libros parece que ya no valen. Yo pregunto muchas veces a mis colegas, dime, ¿qué texto ha impactado más en tu pensamiento, en tu carrera, en tu vida? Texto de nuestro campo de la comunicación. Y si los apuro, siempre mencionan libros. Aquel libro de Jesús Martín Barbero, aquel libro de Armand Matelar, aquel libro que yo mismo escribí, y pocos artículos, muy pocos. ¿Por qué? Porque en nuestro campo y en las ciencias sociales en general, los libros, creo yo, suelen ser muy importantes. Suelen ser importantes porque recogen un tramo largo, una investigación larga, un pensamiento largo, y no el artículo que cada año hay que publicar. Decía David Harvey en una conferencia hace 3 años, justo antes de la pandemia, que vivimos en un mundo apurado porque el capitalismo tiene apuro. La obsolescencia planificada es parte de su lógica. Y eso se trasladó también al mundo académico. Decía él, David Harvey, hace 30, 40 años, alguien que había escrito más de 2 libros en su vida ya era considerado poco serio. Y ahora, si yo no escribo un artículo por año o cada 6 meses, parece que todos creen que me he muerto, que ya no existo. Porque hay la urgencia, el apuro por la productividad. Artículos en inglés, además. Aquí tenemos el problema de la lengua franca, que nos ayuda a entendernos en esta conversación, pero que al no ser nuestra lengua materna, quita mucho de los matices en los que podemos producir. Y finalmente las revistas de alto impacto son casi siempre, por una lógica de mercado editorial, ciertas revistas que están en ciertos índices, y por ejemplo esto ha hecho que muchos de los que están en el mundo académico ya no quieren producir para las revistas nacionales o regionales, porque lo que les exigen sus sistemas de evaluación no es publicar en esas revistas, con lo cual esas revistas nacionales o locales se mueren, van desapareciendo, ya no tienen valor para el mundo académico y entonces pueden recoger poco de lo más potente, salvo por suerte los viejos sabios de nuestra tribu que siguen valorando escribir despacio, tranquilo y publicar donde sus amigos los acogen y donde los invitamos a escribir. Realmente hay hoy en nuestro mundo quienes plantean que ¿para qué revistas locales, nacionales, regionales? Basta con las grandes revistas que circulan en el mundo. Eso es muy parecido a lo que pasa en el mundo de la comunicación. Solo vale lo que las grandes empresas de comunicación producen, solo vale también lo que las grandes empresas editoriales académicas producen. Contra esto creo que tenemos que pelear y tenemos que plantear alternativas. Se están desarrollando planteos alternativos en el mundo, yo celebraría que juntos hagamos un esfuerzo por también abrir esa posibilidad. Estos eran los tres aspectos que yo quería plantear. Entendiendo entonces por decolonial la posibilidad del diálogo entre diferentes en términos de igualdad, decolonizar la comunicación, decolonizar la manera de producir saberes en torno a la comunicación, lo cual implica decolonizar también el mundo académico.
Muchas gracias, Gabriel, por la presentación. Seguramente tendremos cuestiones y comentarios. Y ahora, a continuación, vamos a escuchar a nuestra querida profesora de la Universidad Complutense e integrante del Consejo Directivo de ECREA, Patricia Nuñez. Por favor, adelante.
Muchísimas gracias, profesores, por la oportunidad de estar aquí. Gracias por este momento tan interesante, por proponer este panel que creo que es muy necesario. La verdad es que el profesor Gabriel ha tocado muchos de los temas que yo tenía pensados para tocar, que me parece muy interesante, igual que los otros profesores y profesoras acerca de la decolonización. Voy a ser muy breve, sé que vamos mal de tiempo. Voy a partir de unas ideas globales para luego contar algún caso práctico, puesto que Daniela me dijo hay que dar soluciones. Iba a proponer bueno, pues el día a día con lo que trabajamos. Creo que se ha tocado por parte del profesor el tema de Internet, que yo quería hablar sobre ese tema acerca de priorizar lo humano y la dignidad de las personas. Hablar de un humanismo tecnológico, situando a las personas en el centro de todos esos avances y de la carrera universitaria. La ciberética y la ética de la inteligencia artificial, en teoría procuran pues ayudar a la ciencia y al desarrollo. Creo que de parte de la universidad podíamos contribuir más a que esa ética no fuera simplemente unos códigos éticos superficiales y ahondara mucho más en el impacto hacia la práctica social y lo humano, y no se quedara solamente en ese desarrollo, bueno, pues de unos códigos. Hablo de la tecnología sobre todo porque en muchos casos se ha convertido en el conocimiento de la realidad que nos rodea, y sobre todo a través de nuestros estudiantes, quedando pues bastante por hacer para crear una conciencia crítica, siendo los futuros profesionales en ciencias sociales de los medios de comunicación, como ya se ha apuntado aquí. La tecnología debe buscar el bienestar de la gente y la lucha por la igualdad, que es lo que también deberíamos pretender, como bien se decía en este panel anteriormente, y puede ayudar a un diálogo imprescindible en todos los ámbitos, con un trabajo multidisciplinar entre todas las ciencias sociales, que es muy interesante y que puede enriquecer el conocimiento, y desde una manera horizontal, que hablaré de ella también después cuando hable de mis proyectos prácticos. Todos estos pilares y sin ellos es imposible la colaboración a nivel global. En ese sentido, en Europa, que es un poco lo que me toca hablar, y no hay que hablar de norte a sur, estoy totalmente en contra de todo eso, de ayuda, sino de colaboración. Hay iniciativas de alto calado que a veces, bueno, pues no avanzan como quisiéramos y se quedan solo en el papel, pero sí que pretenden establecer, bueno, unos marcos éticos sobre estas colaboraciones, como iniciativas como también por parte del Gobierno de España, también, donde se habla de derechos colectivos, a efectos de garantizar el bienestar social, o algunas iniciativas por parte de la OCDE sobre ciudades inteligentes, ciudades éticas, ciberética, etc. En el contexto educativo nos toca formar a ciudadanos del futuro con esa inteligencia digital, y también poner la humanización a favor de los tiempos y la ayuda, donde nuestros alumnos tienen que ser gestores del cambio. en un futuro, como bien decía el profesor, a medio y largo plazo, porque uno de los graves problemas que tenemos efectivamente es la obsolescencia, todo lo que es efímero. Hay tareas que resultan inaplazables, como son el alineamiento ante los retos globales en los que todos debemos colaborar, problemas comunes, agendas muy complejas, que ya también se ha hablado aquí, de crisis, cuidado del planeta, búsqueda de justicia social y sobre todo, pues, innovación social y sostenibilidad. Sin ello, sin cooperar, es imposible. Ha habido ya varias voces contactadas a través de hacia la Complutense para colaborar desde Brasil, Colombia, por una ética universitaria, una ética diferente, donde saltemos un poco las barreras de lo que significa la colaboración más allá de un paper, como bien se decía aquí en este panel, y que significa un poco más implicación hacia el mundo. Y por parte de varias universidades de Brasil ha habido un llamado con los que estoy colaborando para que eso se pueda hacer, creando una sociedad más colaborativa a nivel universitario. Como bien decía el profesor, y no voy a ahondar en eso porque lo ha hablado él y lo tenía aquí escrito, en España existe un sistema de evaluación que se llama ANECA, donde lo importante es el logro individual y se ha olvidado el espíritu colectivo universitario y académico por las agencias de evaluación, donde se prima, pues el individualismo. Por lo tanto, hay que luchar, y estoy totalmente de acuerdo, de la universidad como modo de asentar conocimiento y hablar desde nuestra responsabilidad mucho más colectiva, ¿no?, que de pensar en el futuro y de ayuda a la universidad, formando un ambiente hacia nuestros alumnos, que yo creo que está la clave ahí, no solamente en nosotros, sino para que nuestros alumnos y alumnas, que van a ser futuros profesionales de los medios de comunicación, se impliquen desde ya con todo el planeta y con ese espíritu reflexivo y crítico que se ha perdido mucho, de responsabilidad colectiva, de lucha colectiva por el bienestar social. Por eso es fundamental luchar a largo plazo y cooperar con esos problemas globales. Dicho esto, y bajo de manera muy concreta para ser breve, soluciones. En la Complutense tenemos unos proyectos Erasmus que no se quedan con el nuevo marco, que va del 2021 al 2027, no se quedan simplemente en los países europeos, sino que invito a colaborar con una subvención de más de 28.000 millones de euros que tenemos en el Erasmus Plus, un programa más inclusivo, más ecológico y vinculado con la diversidad, donde se puede participar. Hay proyectos en Japón, con China, Rusia, Israel, Armenia, Senegal, Colombia, Argentina, Ghana, Vietnam, etc. También la Alianza de Unión Iberoamericana de Universidades, integradas por 5 universidades españolas y latinoamericanas, que están haciendo mucho trabajo. No quiero quitar mucho tiempo, pero en la página de la Complutense se puede ver esta colaboración, y el nuevo marco de Una Europa, donde se han unido 11 universidades europeas, rompiendo un poco la educación tradicional y yendo a programas transversales de colaboración entre distintos países. En ese sentido, y de manera muy rápida, quería decir cómo estamos trabajando en mi grupo de investigación. Esa colaboración a nivel de la UNESCO, donde pertenezco en Unitwin, en universidades de género, trabajamos con muchos países del mundo dentro del marco de la UNESCO, haciendo, aunque no es enseñanza formal, de manera informal, talleres donde se colabora entre estos diversos países del mundo, formando tanto a profesores como a alumnos y alumnas, y colaborando en investigaciones fuera de los marcos tradicionales de investigación. También con Colombia llevo años trabajando, y ahí pues me ha acordado el profesor Gabriel, que decía bajar a los pueblos. Colaboramos con los pueblos. Para nosotros los pueblos indígenas son fuente de conocimiento y de sabiduría, donde van los alumnos de la Complutense y van los alumnos de Colombia a colegios donde estudiamos y donde nos enseñan cuáles son sus prácticas, pues sus prácticas históricas, y lo intentamos nosotros completar, y ellos con nosotros, a través de trabajos comunes, y por lo tanto lo llevamos tanto a la Universidad de Colombia como a la Universidad Española, creando grupos de trabajos entre nuestros alumnos y aprendiendo a través de semilleros, que lo hemos aprendido en España, cómo se puede, bueno, pues ayudar y crear un mundo mejor. También con proyectos europeos, donde estamos trabajando con países que nos enseñan su cultura y nosotros la nuestra, hablando de excelencia académica, no desde el punto de vista tradicional, sino incluyendo otras series de variables. Y por supuesto consiguiendo proyectos desde primero de grado con los alumnos, donde van aprendiendo el aprendizaje-servicio, cómo aprender a hacer, y van siendo luego ellos mentores de los alumnos que vienen. También procuramos, por lo tanto, hacer lobby en liderar revistas, en participar en tribunales, en hacer revistas diferentes y congresos comunes donde pueda haber otras voces que sean diferentes a la enseñanza formal. Y dejo todo esto abierto para un posible y posterior discusión. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Patricia, por los comentarios y las propuestas y acciones en curso. A continuación, vamos a escuchar la representante de la IAMCR acá en esta sesión y profesora de la Universidad Federal Fluminense en Brasil, Andrea Medrado. Por favor, te toca a ti hablar ahora.
Gracias, Fernando. Obrigada. Thank you. I also wanted to share my screen. Is that am I allowed? Let's see. Yes. Can you see my slides? Okay. Just a second. Sorry. Okay, thank you so much. Yes, thank you for the invitation. It's a big pleasure to be here representing IAMCR in this dialogue with ALAIC and colleagues all over the world. The title of this presentation, I think connects, what I wanted to talk today connects really well with what, all of you were talking earlier. So I'm really happy to be here and exchange these ideas. And I wanted to focus specifically on this idea that's been touched upon already many times by the previous speakers of a South-to-South connection, dialogues, cooperations, and specifically, in my case, media activism, because this is a topic that I've been working on for the past 3 to 4 years. So the thoughts that I'm sharing today, they stem from a project that I worked on called eVoices, about when I was at UFI in Brazil before moving to the UK, focusing on uses of digital technology and media activism in the global South. And these ideas are also being organized into a book on South-to-South communication, drawing on exchanges mainly between Brazil and Kenya. So Latin America, Brazil, and Africa, Kenya. And yes, these ideas are now being organized into a book that the manuscript is due soon. So wish me luck, co-authored with Isabella Rega, and hopefully will come out next year. So I was really happy to hear, for example, Professor Viola Milton talking about these ideas of Afroecology, because one thing we've been trying to do is to connect these ideas that stem from African epistemologies with Latin American epistemologies, participatory approaches from Freire, Pals Borda, etc. And really focusing on this idea of the global South. I think the first thing that we need to do is to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we use this term, which is a useful term in many ways and also a problematic term, as we know. But I mean, obviously, in the case of this project that I've been working on, the countries are located in the geographic South, Africa, Latin America, Brazil, Kenya. But the meaning is much broader, as to cite Boaventura Souza Santos, Portuguese scholar, the global South is connected to suffering, inequality, oppression. And I also really like this idea of the global South as a political solidarity project across countries. So it's worth asking, this is something that's always been really relevant, but is this even more urgent in a post-pandemic world to have this kind of South-to-South connections and conversations, given the worsening of the already existing inequalities? And I also wanted to ask today, has the pandemic worsened some other forms of pre-existing pandemics or endemics, you know. And I will start with an example from my own country, Brazil. So in 2020, when the World Health Organization declared COVID to be pandemic, in favelas, slum shanty towns in Rio and other cities like Alemão and Maré, residents started to mobilize. And they formed groups like in Alemão, the Committee Crisis or Mobilization Fronts in Maré, campaigns to fight the pandemics in the favelas. They devised communication plans, loudspeakers, how people could prevent catching the virus and where they should go to if they needed help, which connects to the kind of broader understanding of communication needed that Gabriel was referring to earlier. And in a few days, the media activists in these spaces started to receive messages from residents saying, you know, well, they needed to buy soap, they had no soap, they had no water, they were hungry. And they also had to deal with frequent police operations with all these crises going on. So to cite Gisele Martins, a famous media activist and researcher academic from Rio, people are dying of COVID, but also hunger and also from bullets. So police brutality is one of these endemics. And, you know, in Brazil, for instance, in the first 4 months of 2020, by their own count, the Rio police killed 666 people, which was a 43% increase if we compare to April 2019, before the pandemic. And if we talk about Kenya, again, the focus of the project I worked on, we're also talking about a scenario of heavy-handed policing of the poor, working class in formalized areas, as if these were the only solutions to security issues. And in both countries, and I'm sure this applies to several other contexts, media portrayals being characterized by binary oppositions between formal, informal cities, the good citizen versus the criminal citizen, the state versus the enemy, you know, these areas like favelas and shanty towns. So in line with these discourses, daily killings being normalized in Brazil, Latin America, Kenya, Africa, and many other parts of the world, unfortunately. So as we face the challenges of a global pandemic, but also these local endemics like hunger, police brutality, I wanted to ask, what is the role of media? What is the role of media activism? Can we think of a type of a South-to-South dialogue promoted by media activism to change these circumstances? And I just wanted to also acknowledge the credit of this image, photo by Pablo Jacob, which was widely circulated on Brazilian media, of a mom crying the death of her son killed by the police. So to begin with, how do we think of media activism in general? We might think, the first thing that comes to our minds, this idea of media platforms being used for social change, for activist purposes, for changing what's wrong, exposing wrongdoings, providing alternative, richer, more complex representations, fighting injustices, mobilizing in times of crisis, as I just mentioned in relation to the Brazilian favelas during the pandemics. But we also might think of media activism in terms of goals, meeting these goals. And then I often wonder, is this understanding perhaps too instrumentalist, colonial even, given the complexities of our post-pandemic worlds, particularly in the global South? And several colleagues, I think, have asked this as well. For example, our colleague Bruce Mutsvairo has asked, if we restrict media, media activism to this kind of instrumental capabilities, would this lead to unrealistic expectations in the context of the plural global South? And as if sort of they were always doomed to fail. So how can the possibilities of media activism, media for social change be celebrated when there's such a high price to pay sometimes? For example, for denouncing police brutality, with arrests, with repression, death, as it happened with Marielle Franco in Brazil. Is it reasonable to expect those finding it difficult to put food on the table, which is, hunger has been so much worse now in our post-pandemic world, to be active in this kind of media activism? And should a South-to-South dialogue revolve around returning to the basics of media activism for survival? And if this is the case, is this a backlash? So these are all very difficult questions that I have no answers for, but I'd like to just exchange these thoughts with you. So motivated by these sort of provocations and questions, I would like to think of an understanding of what I'm calling, we could call South to South media activism, which is connected to two main axes. And again, this connects to a lot of ideas that were raised here earlier in this panel. The first one revolves around the pluriversal dialogical spaces, valuing the knowledge that stems from the multiple pluriversal sources, as Gabriel was saying, the wisdoms, the knowledges that we value, that we emphasize. And this, in a way, in a Freirean sense, is a way to avoid the hierarchies between knowledgeable, knowledgeless, inferior, superior, south, and north. In the beginning of the pandemic, for example, I attended a webinar with Kenyan and Brazilian groups talking about media activism as a tool to hold governments accountable for human rights violations. And I thought it was a really, really interesting experience in terms of these exchanges. In a way, kind of the opportunities that the Zoomify world confers us, although they're very, of course, limited in many ways. And the second axis is connected to this idea of mobilizing collective memories that has already been addressed here earlier as well, and histories. And I never forget the image that we have there is from the Maré Museum. So the first museum to be located in a favela area, Favela da Maré in Brazil. And when we went there to do some activities, and when we were conducting some activities with the project there, the director, Claudia Rose, she said, well, you cannot really grow as a person without knowing who you are and where you come from. That really needs to be the starting point. And it's a lesson about pride, self-awareness, favela pride. Because community projects to thrive, yes, people, of course, want to learn maths, skills, languages, but they also really crave to learn about their own histories and stories, their ancestors' histories and struggles. And I think this is really important in the context of South to South. So just some concluding thoughts. This panel is about, global communication dialogues, and I'm here representing IAMCR after all, which comprises North and South, because we sort of emphasizing this South to South approach. Does this mean that the points I've just raised and everyone else raised here earlier do not apply to global North contexts? And I'd say no, of course not. They're South in the North, they're North in the South. But also, of course, we need to be very aware of the dangers of giving a single essence to the South. But this sort of South to South approach represents a humble attempt to consider the contextual contingencies that affect marginalized, vulnerable peoples in the global South. And yes, they also stem from a desire to offer alternatives to models that are often based on global North experiences only. So, and importantly, I think to decolonize and to add, to go back to the topic of this panel, to our cooperative spirit here, we need a strong willingness to learn more about each other, to learn more about our erased histories and stories. And as we learn, I think it's also very important to keep sharing and echoing these stories and sharing them from the margins. So that's what I wanted to share today. Thank you.
Obrigado. Gracias. Thank you, Andrea, por la presentación. Y finalmente tendremos la ocasión de escucharle a Beate Josephi con una perspectiva importante desde la Oceanía a través de su experiencia con tantas investigaciones y aportes en la asociación. Go ahead, Beate, please.
Thank you, Fernando. I also would like to share my screen. Would you permit me to share my screen? Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
My screen is up, but I'm not quite sure where to. I clicked share screen, and I put up my PowerPoint, so share screen, share. Is it better now?
Yes, of
Good.
course.
Okay, good. So thank you very much for giving me a chance to speak at this panel. And as a journalism scholar and also former head of the Journalism Research and Education section, I will be using my experiences in that field. And of course, I am speaking from Sydney, Australia, which is geographically in the global south, but not counted as the global south. All the same, for a long time now, I've worked towards redirecting our scholarly endeavors away from Europe and North America. And since this is an IAMCR panel, I would like to note that the Journalism Research and Education section for much of this century has had section heads from the global south. In 2000, it was Mohammed Safi Hasim from Malaysia, followed by me. Well, that's the geographical south, followed by Ibrahim Saleh from Egypt, who also worked for a while in South Africa, and then Claudia Lago from Brazil, and now Sadia Jamil from Pakistan, working in Abu Dhabi, who actually has recently published a volume edited together with Anna Gladkova, Ethnic Journalism in the Global South. So there are endeavors about collaboration in that field. But also, what are the efforts in redressing the balance and making us look at countries other than those which dominate our field of study? There are, for example, a number of major comparative empirical studies which embrace most countries of this globe and try to understand them, which now have been underway for quite some time, like the World of Journalism, or a number of them have their origin in Latin America, like initiated by Claudia Medrado, such as Journalism Students Around the Globe study, or a major study into the difference between role orientations and role performances of journalists. But these studies are still mostly based on a Western theoretical approach. But, excuse me, but these efforts don't mask two major hurdles. One is that Europe and North America hold sway at conferences and in publications and papers given at conferences. I don't have the IAMCR figures, which I imagine are a bit better than ICA's figures, but Cherry and George, who is a scholar from Singapore and now teaches in Hong Kong, has permitted me to use the figures he put together for a similar panel in political communication at the recent ICA conference in Paris. And these figures show that people from a group of countries that make up 13% of the world's population, that's the circle to the right, have an about 2/3 input, and that's the circle on the left, into what is studied, researched, and talked about at communication conferences like ours. It's the power of language, with English being accepted as a lingua franca. It's the economic power of conference participation and then subsequent publication, which translate into journal ratings, which affect university rankings. So this is unfortunately the kind of wheel in which we are in. But there is a second hurdle, which can also be seen in this graph. And this has to do with the norms our discipline embraces, such as freedom of expression, closely linked to liberal democracies. I personally have questioned for some time the close link between journalism and democracy, but I won't go into that now because that is a different and very lengthy story. But from Deqiang Ji's graph, which is based on the VDEM Institute's Democracy Report 2022, shows that liberal democracies on whose values these norms are based only make up a third of the countries worldwide, and that's the central circle. Then there are flawed democracies, which are electoral democracies, and I believe a number of the South American countries are counted amongst them. Just under half of the world, however, again, the central circle, are electoral autocracies, particularly in Africa, and closed autocracies in the Middle East and in Asia. If we now turn to the map provided by Freedom House on freedom of expression, we come to this. In the global south, much of Latin America, South Africa, and also Australia are considered free. But many other parts of the globe, of the global south, Africa and Southeast Asia in particular, are at best partly free. So what can be done about this disparity of norms rooted in a smallish part of the world and a global reality that does not match? Along with Deqiang Ji, I do not think that giving up on freedom of expression or critical thinking is the answer. But what scholars in the global south can do and are doing, and many of my previous speakers have talked about this, is to direct their research into these electoral democracies, into these electoral autocracies and closed autocracies, to understand and analyze the workings of their systems. No country is a monolith. There are spaces in which communication moves and has to move. And there are more ways of understanding journalism than just looking at the adversarial journalism that is practiced in the US or in the UK. There are many more other ways. And only by making these spaces visible in our research can we grasp and appreciate the mechanisms of the media systems in the global south and understand who and how people move within these systems and how they wield power. Undoubtedly, in this process, there will be language barriers to overcome, especially in Asia and in Africa. But I've seen great collaborative work coming out of Latin America, which has the benefit of an almost common language, like, for example, Martin Ole Alonso's edited volume on Culturas Periodísticas Iberoaméricas, for which I had the honor to write the foreword. And talking about cooperation, I just briefly want to mention the Department of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney, and also have a few words about ANZCA, the Australian New Zealand Communication Association. MECO, the Department of Media and Communications, is active in countries in the Asia Pacific region. That is the focal point here. Of course, there are strong connections to European scholars and institutions, but in the global south, it is Asia, meaning China and Hong Kong and South Korea, or in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and in the Pacific, particularly Fiji and Papua New Guinea, with which collaborative projects are being conducted. ANZCR, the Australian and New Zealand Communication Association, has recently created the position of an international officer in order to promote a collaborative project. But again, this will be first sought in the Asia-Pacific region. And also since 2018, Australia has its first philanthropically funded institute, the Judith Neilson Institute for Quality Journalism, which also is very much focused on the Asia region. But this will not prevent us to also engage in projects in other parts of the world. And I know more of literary collaborations, which go very much into the area that Andrea talked about, the South to South area, where Australia, South Africa, under the auspices of Nobel Prize winner John Coetzee from South Africa, and Argentina are working together. So it doesn't need to be only in the communication field, but also in other language fields where this South to South collaboration does happen. But hopefully that all of this, what we are talking about, this work in journalism and on media systems that is being created, will help to counterbalance the hegemony of North America and Europe. So that's my hope. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Beate. Muchas gracias a cada uno de nuestros panelistas por acompañarnos en esta jornada de pensamiento, debate y reflexión. Hemos escuchado intervenciones muy diversas y profundas, y en un punto vemos que la palabra decolonización tiene muchísimos significados en relación a las geografías, a las posiciones, a los lugares desde los cuales es enunciada y pensada. La decolonización en un punto también nos devuelve a la pregunta sobre la subalternidad y el poder, y sobre cómo comprendemos el mundo en el que vivimos desde la posición, desde ciertas posiciones subalternas. En ese sentido, para nuestra asociación es muy importante poder deconstruir el pensamiento y poder sumar a partir de nuestras posiciones diferentes para construir y colaborar de una manera diferente y productiva. En ese sentido, solo tengo una pregunta para hacer a todos nuestros panelistas, porque tenemos poco tiempo para el debate, pero realmente las intervenciones que hemos escuchado tienen cada una riqueza, una densidad y una potencia que daría lugar a muchísimas preguntas. Sin embargo, quisiera ponerlos en diálogo y preguntarles en qué sentido han sido interpelados, en qué sentido han sido interpelados a partir de las exposiciones de los colegas, a partir de lo que han escuchado de otras latitudes, y cómo creen que podemos sumar desde nuestras respectivas posiciones hacia un trabajo colaborativo, pensando en que también la idea del sur no es una idea geográfica, como bien lo propuso Beate, sino que tiene que ver con una idea de poder y subalternidad en sus múltiples expresiones. Entonces, mi pregunta para cada uno de ustedes es de qué manera han sido interpelados por los otros panelistas y cómo podemos sumar a un trabajo colaborativo. Muchas gracias.
Deqiang?
Okay, All right, thank you for. I'm really glad to listen to so many wonderful presentations, really touching different point of this theme, like decolonization, South-to-South communication, and something else. I think it's hard to respond to each presentation, but from my point of view, I think when we talk about the collaboration, especially in such a so-called post-pandemic era, I think we are having more opportunities instead of only continuing our past ways. For example, as the president of ALAIC mentioned, that in this digitized world, I think we have more channels, especially for interpersonal or intergroup academic cooperation opportunities than before, because previously we have to mobilize a lot of resources to meet each other and to see how we can do our research, and it will last a long time for negotiation and finally realized our research project. And nowadays, I think because of digital technology, no matter where we are now, we can easily mobilize the different resources, the people, the fundings, and also technologies to work together. I mean, this creates a kind of platforming force for the global academic collaboration, not only the South to South, but also the North and South. So in this case, I think we are having a new opportunity for a hybridized digital academic cooperation space. I think including us and also the people who have the same intentions to working with the people from the global South or from the societies that we are referring to. This is the one thing. Another thing that I would like to highlight is I think we should also focus on some key concept, because from even today we have 3 languages, and the different languages dealing with different academic vocabularies or concept. So I think in this case we are not only continually using some traditional concept like the global South or global North, and even the decolonization, as we discussed a lot, but something else. And I think we are in shortage. I mean, for maybe just my personal point of view, we're in shortage of some new concept for bridging us together, especially in such a crisis time. I think we're really in shortage of this kind of concept, which is the key materials for us to do theoretical innovation. So I think in this case, we should from multilingual perspective to create some kind of new or combine the traditional concept together for a new conceptualization work, so we can have a common ground for collaboration, because traditional languages really differentiate from each other, especially for the country like China. The language, as our last speaker mentioned, that is a major barrier even for us, I think, today. So I think in this case we really taking advantage of digital technology and also the post-crisis, post-pandemic context, we might have more opportunities to develop further collaboration, but based on some new conceptual work. Yeah, just very tentative response to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Deqiang. Viola, could you hear us, please?
Thank you so much, colleagues. Yeah, I was very drawn to the ideas that I think it was Prof. Gabriel had put forward about the notion of the global South as a subversive practice. And I think Andrea also sort of touched on that a little bit. And I'm thinking that, as was also mentioned by others, that a lot of this work is already being done. A lot of the conceptual work has already been done in many different spaces. And yes, there was a time where access was the issue, that we could not, for example, read or understand the work that was produced within our spaces. But we are now within a space and within a phase, as Deqiang just pointed out, that we've also experienced ourselves today, and at previous IAMCR conferences also, where it is possible to do, on the spot interpretations and translations, etc. And so the time really is right now for us to do this sort of collaborative work. I, for example, know that in South Africa, the move towards decolonization of the curriculum has drawn greatly and benefited greatly from the work of South American scholars in ways that one could not have imagined before. And to have found out that a lot of this work was already done way before we had even thought it possible to imagine a new way of doing intellectualism and doing intellectual work. So that to me is a good move, and it shows me that there is already a move towards the types of conversations that we are envisioning, right? And some of these conversations are happening via, for example, how we engage with scholarly work. So that there's a move away from only referencing work from the global north, from only assuming that the sort of universal knowledge that has been pushed is the knowledge that we should be reproducing within our spaces. I think to a large extent that sort of idea and notion has already been debunked and has proven sort of false. And spaces like IAMCR, I have to say much more so than ICA, for example, not to bash on anything or anyone, has been an inviting space. But I was surprised to see that the figures that, well, I shouldn't lie, I wasn't surprised. It did not surprise me at all to see the figures that was referenced in terms of which papers are accepted in specific conference groups and how those papers continue to sort of, or how those selection processes continue to negate knowledge from this space. A couple of weeks ago, I was approached by the editor of a journal for whom I am an editorial board member. And I couldn't understand why I was so, slightly triggered by an email that ostensibly was supposed to be a nice email, right? Because the email was about how do we include more voices from Africa? But the email then goes on and says, we find that we have to do a lot of editorial work when we receive papers from Africa. We find that we have to do a lot of work in terms of making the papers publishable. And I received that email shortly after getting a response about a review process that I was involved in. I was one of the reviewers for a paper, and that paper was using the Afroecological toolkit, heuristic tool that Winston Mann and myself had developed. And I got insight into the other review report as the report was sent to the author. And I was surprised at the different approaches to the paper from myself and the other reviewer. And I do not know who the other reviewer is. I do not know where the other reviewer comes from. But I could guess, because without even engaging with either the Afroecological toolkit or any of the other theories that the author had mentioned, the paper was derided as being too narrow, as being too insular in its focus, as being something that is trying to make the world flatter rather than broader, even though the author himself said they are using this toolkit because this toolkit is broadening the space, right? It is saying, let's walk in tandem with, let's not throw out, let's look at what it is that we can bring to the table and how we can alter maybe what is already there. And so for me, that shows that, the South is in the North in as much as the North is in the South also, that there is greater need for us to push our work in ways that would also engage audiences outside of this community that is our own. Outside of this community where we are already accepted, or where we already accept that the knowledge that is generated from our space is worthwhile. And to do so in a way that does not contribute to the sort of marketing ploys that is pushed by publishing houses, because they tend to focus on something that at the moment would seem popular and would make money, rather than to consider the idea of broadening the academic space, the intellectual space, the knowledge space. And then at the same time, you are sort of stuck in terms of, okay, if I'm not going into this space, now I'm forced into the rules of engagement of this space, then again negates the type of work that we are trying to do. All in all, for me to circle back to, that is why I was so intrigued by the idea that Gabriel had pushed forward in terms of how do we make this global south a subversive practice that also allows us a voice within the academy to be reckoned with. Thank you.
Thank you, Viola. Gabriel, por favor.
Sí, yo estaba pensando que esto que está pasando hoy a mí me recuerda mucho algunas cosas que originaron un trabajo inicial que ALAIC realizó con ECREA, con la Asociación Europea similar a ALAIC, nuestra hermana europea. Y ese diálogo para mí tuvo muchos problemas, pero muchas virtudes también. Y la principal fue que fue un diálogo, realmente un diálogo, de igual a igual. Y produjo un libro que intentaré ahora mostrarles, a ver si lo consigo, aquí en pantalla. A ver, vamos a ver, aquí. Este libro. A ver si lo pueden ver. ¿Lo están viendo? Que pueden ustedes conseguir en nuestra propia página de ALAIC, en la web de ALAIC, que fue de una enorme riqueza. Y quizás podamos hacer algo similar hacia el futuro. Este libro se basó en una mirada teórica y recorrimos 6 tradiciones posibles para pensar la comunicación en América Latina y en Europa. Y yo creo que tuvo ya, además de incorporar específicamente la decolonialidad como una posibilidad, como una de las miradas teóricas, junto con eso, fue en sí mismo, me parece, un esfuerzo decolonial. Porque no había allí un diálogo con foco en Europa, sino un diálogo de igual a igual entre América Latina y Europa. Hay corrientes que tuvieron un origen europeo, pero también hay corrientes con un origen fuertemente latinoamericano. Quizás podamos pensar algo similar. Yo después de escucharlos a ustedes, percibí las semejanzas y las grandes diferencias también. ¿Cómo se entiende la democracia en cada lugar? ¿Qué significan las tradiciones en cada lugar? Para China, la tradición occidental tiene un valor distinto, quizás, que para otros sures. El nunca más en África tiene un sentido muy similar al que vivimos en muchos países latinoamericanos, pero también se perciben las diferencias. Podemos a veces sintonizar más fácil con unos que con otros, pero lo rico es ese diálogo. Entonces me pregunto si no podríamos iniciar uno o dos diálogos o una articulación de 2 diálogos. Uno sobre las agendas temáticas, los problemas de hoy, la comunicación y sus problemas hoy. ¿Qué entender por democracia y por democratización de la comunicación? ¿Qué entender, cómo pensar Internet hoy? ¿Cómo pensar los problemas del periodismo hoy, desde distintas partes del mundo? Esa podría ser una agenda. Otra agenda posible sería retomar ese diálogo de tradiciones teóricas desde distintas partes. Me impresionó mucho, especialmente la primera intervención de nuestro colega de China, cómo esa visita de una tradición occidental, la de Wilbur Sham, impactó tanto en China. Algo que aquí miraríamos con una perspectiva muy crítica, pero que uno entiende que en China eso tenga un cierto impacto. Bueno, me imagino lo rico que podría ser un diálogo entre tradiciones teóricas distintas, como el que tuvimos con Europa, pero desde otros lugares, cómo las distintas perspectivas han sido incorporadas y apropiadas y reformuladas y resignificadas, a veces con origen en Estados Unidos, en Europa, pero también cómo hay perspectivas propias que surgieron en cada lugar y que a veces desconocemos mucho. Me pregunto entonces si no estaríamos en condiciones de intentar un diálogo similar. Para hacer aquel libro, les cuento, a los que no conocen la historia, fue un enorme trabajo que implicó algo distinto a los libros de recopilación de artículos. Porque para cada tema o para cada tradición, podríamos decir, para cada tradición teórica, había siempre dos artículos, uno europeo y uno latinoamericano. Y luego había un tercero, un diálogo entre esos dos. A veces un diálogo directo y otras veces un diálogo mediado, con una intervención de alguno de nosotros. Pueden mirarlo allí. Yo recuerdo especialmente el que me tocó a mí, la riqueza enorme que ese diálogo tuvo. En ese sentido no fue un libro tradicional de juntar artículos, sino de conversación, de dialogar. Podríamos quizás intentar algo similar. Sabemos que da mucho trabajo, que lleva tiempo, que se sale de los márgenes de la productividad que nos exigen en el mundo académico, pero quizás sea de una riqueza mucho mayor. Yo en ese libro y en esa parte del diálogo que me tocó articular sobre la tradición alternativista de la comunicación alternativa, citaba a un poeta de mi país, de Uruguay. Y para terminar quiero también recordarlo aquí para invitarnos a esa conversación. Ese poeta dice en un momento: qué grande el mundo y qué pequeño, qué lejos los amigos y qué cerca.
Gracias, Gabo. Creo que es una perspectiva muy estimulante para los próximos pasos de esta red. Y hablando de red, creo que sería importante, Patricia, escucharle agradeciendo por todos los esfuerzos compartidos entre ALAIC y ECREA en los últimos años.
Gracias, Fernando. Gracias a todos los profesores, profesoras que están aquí por la oportunidad. Creo que sí que podemos hacer mucho desde ECREA, como ha dicho el profesor Gabriel. Creo que se abre una etapa interesante. Que no se quede en este panel solamente, por favor, sino que podamos compartir ideas prácticas de acción. El libro me parece muy concreto, igual que encuentros quizá más, no solamente para congresos, sino pues quizá más a menudo para compartir, bueno, pues estos cambios tanto en el idioma, como decía el profesor Deqiang, como también, bueno, pues esos cambios en el conocimiento. Por lo tanto, sí que me gustaría proponer esos intercambios de diálogos más a menudo, productos que van más allá de las mediciones que nos exigen los sistemas tradicionales, y también, ¿por qué no?, algún seminario compartido también para todos nuestros alumnos y alumnas, donde puedan ver distintos puntos de vista, que creo que eso es la formación para los comunicadores y como decíamos, a través de estas grandes redes que tenemos de Internet. O sea, yo propongo acciones concretas a partir de ahora que podamos, pues que sean tangibles para poder avanzar en estos cambios. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Patricia. Beata, please, could you, yes, please,
Yes,
could you
hi.
hear us?
It's getting late
Beata.
in Sydney, I have to say.
And please,
yes, I'm here.
time is yours.
Yes, I could hear it, yeah. Thank you. Yes, it is getting late in Sydney, But I would like to say that I very much like Viola's idea of having a different theoretical basis, and that this different theoretical approach is heard louder and louder, but also the idea of, sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly, of our Chinese colleague, of an indigenization of the theory. I can fully understand that this is necessary for so many countries to make the theory more their own, rather than having something that is imported from the outside. And as I said, the more we hear about it, the louder these voices are, the louder we speak ourselves in it. To take Viola's example, yes, I see many reviews, and you can always tell that there are certain countries where they don't even realize that they're so caught up in their own world that they don't even mention where their research comes from. And that unless we make them aware that there are other approaches, and that their approach is a very specific approach, possibly even an outlier in our world of theoretical possibilities, then this is really very important. And I would like also to say to our Latin American colleagues in particular, at the conference in Cartagena, I was really delighted to hear so much about the Latin American approach, intellectual approach, which I until then was not as familiar. And I think the more we can make ourselves heard in the to take Andrea's point, in the subversive approaches to the theory that is still dominant, but at the moment, to my opinion, proves itself to be more and more fallible, that we can have better offerings, then I look into a better future. Let's put it that way. Thank you very much, and please apologize. I will have to leave. It's getting late in Sydney, as I said, and thank you very much to all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beate. See you soon, I hope. And right now, Andrea, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Paulina, and thank you, Daniela, for the question. I agree with the points that Deqiang raised in the beginning of the difficulty of having, these conceptual umbrellas that can pull us all together. But, and I think that what comes to my mind as well is that this is an effort that requires energy. I think a lot of you already mentioned. So thank you so much as well. Like, it was a great, to hear more and more about how this has been done before. It feels like journalism, it feels like comparative studies, and it needs to, we need to keep finding the energy to keep this going. I think so. Also, at the reminder that Gabriel just gave us of the ECREA ALAIC Latin America Europe dialogues on equal level. So yeah, let's keep the energy flowing. I know it's difficult, it's challenging. I also had stories, Viola, like yours, with my book on South to South, while writing about Africa and Latin America, and the feedback I got was that it was a regional book, and therefore it had to be priced. Okay. Anyway, so I thought that was really interesting because what is a region, right? It's a bit like saying, oh, you have an accent. Well, we all have accents from where we come from. And another point that came from this dialogue, in addition to this being subversive, power, valuing knowledges, was the issue of subjectivity. We all come from different places, and we need to have this subjectivity there and echo, and so that we all acknowledge we all have accents. It's not the accent for what is the different accent. So let's just keep the energy going. And I guess, yeah, I think Gabriel's suggestion as well of doing something similar to the book that was done before, and that we can keep the initiatives like Patricia mentioned as well. yeah, if we do, you know, again, I'll mention energy. We do have the energy. I think we should definitely try to do this more. And on a pragmatic note, I also think people who are based sometimes in more resource-rich institutions and places, we also have a sort of pragmatic responsibility to try to channel these resources on a pragmatic note to make these things happen, or at least with me, it's something that brings me a lot of pleasure when I can do that. I can channel resources from global North institutions, because I know the realities of being based in a global South institution, a global North institution are very, very different. So just being a bit pragmatic, I think if we find opportunities to keep doing initiatives like the one we just had, I think it's really important. So thank you.
Obrigado, Andrea. Gracias. Dani, por favor.
Solamente agradecer a cada uno de ustedes por habernos dado la oportunidad de escucharlos y reflexionar de manera conjunta, horizontal, respetuosa. Necesitamos aprender unos de otros y construir juntos, y es muy importante para ALAIC haber contado con su palabra en esta oportunidad. A pesar de que se ha extendido mucho más de la cuenta nuestro panel, les agradezco el respeto y la dedicación por regalarnos su tiempo para compartir de una manera virtuosa y profunda nuestras necesidades académicas y políticas de generar una mejor comunicación para transformar el mundo en el que vivimos en un lugar en donde haya lugar para todas las voces y todas las personas con nuestras diferencias y nuestras desigualdades. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy en este panel. Ha sido un honor. Gracias.
Igualmente me gustaría agradecerles a ustedes por la oportunidad, diciéndole a mi querido Deqiang que la mistura entre producción occidental y condición indígena es algo muy presente en nuestra realidad global, no solo en China, en América Latina. Decir a Viola que los intentos de búsqueda de una dimensión colectiva también es parte de esta resistencia al never again que hablabas, Viola, y que es algo también muy conectado a las actividades que están siendo puestas en marcha en este diálogo ECREA ALAIC, muy basado en el diálogo de saberes que llega a la investigación y también a actividades de enseñanza y extensión, Patricia. Y decirle a Gabriel que siempre es un honor, un placer escuchar a nuestro querido compañero, porque creo que hay un camino muy largo todavía para que hagamos, y me parece que sí, la inspiración del libro puede ser interesante, no solo para este diálogo atlántico, como un diálogo también en otras partes del mundo. Creo que esta sesión no deja de ser un embrión, un empuje para nuevas producciones existenciales que, Andrea, sigan contando con el apoyo de la ALAIC en las actividades que están siendo siempre propuestas y realizadas a través de ALAIC. Y con eso creo que estamos en condiciones de cerrar, pero al menos parte de este esfuerzo hoy. Igualmente haciendo un agradecimiento a Priscila Asrun, nuestra traductora, que hizo muy importante para, a través de un lenguaje inclusivo, hacer este diálogo posible. Muchas gracias y sigamos en contacto. See you. Thank you.
Gracias. Bye.
Gracias.
No,
Obrigada.
Bye.
Gracias. Adiós.
Adiós.
Thank you.